for 20 years, I haven't really been able to see other people's painting very much, although I've gone on trying. And only today went round the wonderful Dutch portrait exhibition with my wife. We'll go and see that. And during that time, I haven't really been able to get very much from reproductions either. And then about 2 years ago, or just over 2 years ago, I went totally blind. But I've been painting all that time, and I'm still painting. And in the course of finding out how to go on painting, through this loss of sight, and well, partial and then total, that's forced me to think about drawing even more basically than I had before. So this is going to be a pretty sort of shamelessly self-centered talk about really, I suppose, my thoughts in the past and thoughts now to do with drawing. It's going to be about drawing, not about drawings. I mean, definitions are not much help really, but for me, drawing is the sort of where element in design. It's where you put the marks on the paper, it's where you put the paint, it's where you put the clay if you're a potter or a sculptor, it's where you cut away the stone, it's where you place the stones or plant the trees if you're a land artist. All that positioning stuff is drawing. I mean, drawing's other things as well, but I think it's important for me, at any rate, to think of drawing as being involved in all the design activities, and that's the sort of way it is. Now, when I went to Camberwell Art School in 1960, I was about 6 years older than most of the young students there, because I'd done an engineering apprenticeship and qualified as a mechanical engineer before going to art school. And when I got to Camberwell, there were wonderful painters teaching there. The first really to impress me was a marvellous man called Dick Lee, who later became one of my very best friends, who's now sadly dead. And sometime in my first term in a life class, Dick introduced me to the idea that simply looking at some piece of the real world was a completely wonderful thing to do, and that if you looked hard, you found out that you didn't know at all what it looked like, and that wondering about that and trying to draw about it and learning more about it could be a sufficient basis for drawing and painting. And I suppose really I took to that at once and haven't really changed my mind very much about that since. That's pretty much what I've always painted about. Now we'll have the first slides, please, Keith. I'll call them slides, they're not slides anymore. Now, I suppose the two painters who influenced my thinking about painting most, really, in the time I was at Camberwell were Frank Auerbach and Ewan Uglow. And I think the Auerbach's on the left and the Uglow's on the right, but you should know. Now, as you can see from those paintings, if you don't know their work, and I'm sure some of you will, they painted in a very different way. And this was actually a very good thing, because it was completely impossible to try and paint like both of them at the same time. And I was very influenced by both of them, you know, swinging this way and that, really. But what I realised even then was that they had, as well as these very obvious differences of temperament, differences of ways of making painting, they had an enormous amount in common. And partly what that was that they both were entirely committed to a subject which was a piece of the real physical world external to themselves, which they had chosen to look at and make a painting about. And they both believed that the reality was a sort of a kind of standard of marvellousness, which one couldn't really possibly measure up to, but one was going to try. And that one should not stint oneself in one's attempt to do this. And they both use words like true quite a lot, and fact, and words like that. Now, from now on, I'm going to be talking about this sort of painting. It's only one sort of painting, of course, but it's the kind that I've always tried to make, and that's interested me most. That's to say, painting where the subject is a piece of the real physical world, external to oneself, that one has chosen to look at, and by looking arrive at some sort of an experience. And already I'm running into trouble with the language, which is difficult in talking about painting. Whenever you listen to chaps talking about painting or read about it, you want to be very, very critical, because the language is almost always imprecise and often very misleading. You see, really, I want to say that the experience in the artist's head is the subject. And I want a different word for the fact, the physical fact, that is giving rise to the subject. But having made that point, I'll press on, and I'll probably be calling that fact the subject most of the time, as long as you understand that point. Now, Uglo, no, wait a minute, yes, where do I go from here? Now, with this sort of painting, there are three things. There is the artist. When I'm talking about the artist, I will probably use the male pronoun. Please don't be offended if you're female. I'm using it in the all-inclusive way, and I don't want anybody to be upset by it. It saves time, and I'm 70, so that's the way I tend to talk. I'm sorry. So there is the artist. That's one of the three things. Then there is the piece of the real world, which has been chosen as, in that sense I've used the word the subject. And then there is the painting. And those three things are always involved in this sort of painting. And the artist has a relationship with the subject, which gives rise to the experience or subject in the artist's head. And the artist has a relationship with his canvas and his materials, and that gives rise to the painting or the expression of that experience in terms of design. Now, there is a fourth thing, which is in a sense optional in this sort of painting, and that is some sort of projection, some sort of place where, if you wish, in some sense, the canvas can meet the subject outside of yourself. As in, say, a perspective projection or some system of measurement. I'm not going to say very much about this now, a little bit more later on. Uglo, I think, always started with the idea of a painting as an arrangement of colours in a rectangle. He said he started with an idea, and that idea was to do with a very carefully chosen rectangle and ideas about divisions of it, and an idea of a certain sort of physical reality which would give rise to that pattern, if I can call it pattern. Yes, I can, why not? And so he would then spend a lot of time choosing a model of the right proportions, and from time to time even customizing furniture in order that this setup would deliver, so to speak, the two-dimensional half of the idea that he'd started off from. And he arrived at this pattern by a very rigorous system of measuring, which I'll say a little bit more about later. Our art wasn't like this at all. Auerbach was obsessed with, I'll say was because I'm thinking about when he taught me, but he's still alive. Hugo sadly isn't. Auerbach was obsessed with space, and he felt, I think, that unquestionably the most significant part of our experience of reality was that the real world of which we were part was three-dimensional, and he wanted to paint in a way, to draw, so that he could engage with that three-dimensionality of reality in the most direct way. And I don't think for him there is any thought of a sort of meeting place between the canvas and the subject external to himself. There are other artists who I'll mention of whom this is possibly even more the case than with Auerbach. Now I'll have the next two slides, please, Pete. Here we've got a head by Holbein, a fantastic drawing, and a painting by Suti. Now, Holbein may have made these drawings using an optical device called a camera lucida. I think the jury's out about this. I don't know, what the present idea is about it, but certainly it's a possibility. It certainly isn't, so to speak, it's interesting if he did. It isn't what's good about them. But I think what is certain is that so to speak, the flat pattern in the mundane sense of that drawing is very close to, say, what a photograph would have given had it been taken from where his eyes were. The Suti clearly is different. If a photograph had been taken of that person from where Sutin's eyes were, it would have given a very different pattern from that. Now, I don't think that I want to say that either of these works is more figurative, more real, more true than the other. I think they're both intensely real representations of the experience of looking at a human being. Very moving and wonderful. But by virtue of the different personalities of the artists, in the first place, the experience that they had when looking at another human being was different, as it is obviously for all of us, but in this case, pretty dramatically different. And in the second place, and this first and second place are related because they both are to do with the personality of the artist. Their feeling about how materials could best be used on a flat surface to give expression to an experience was different. I'm cracking on through this part because my lectures usually go on for about twice as long as they're supposed to. Next two, please, Pete. Couple more heads. Another Uglo, and a drawing by Leon Kossoff. And some of you here might recognise the sitter because it's John Lassaur who teaches here. Now, at one level, and fairly obviously, one might say, well, the Uglo's more like the Holbein, and the Kossoff's more like the Suti, and that's fair enough. The Uglo, as I've been saying, certainly has got quite a lot to do with the idea of a picture plane. And I think in Uglo's case, at any rate, what happens on that plane was part of his subject. Kossoff, I would say, even more than Auerbach, has not the slightest interest in any sort of understanding of or idea about optical projection in that sort of way. I mean, curiously, Auerbach's, I suspect in the case of that Auerbach, if you had taken a photograph of that girl in the chair, I doubt actually if the pattern of his painting would have been so terribly different from what a photograph would have shown. Though of course it was arrived at in a totally different way. But I think in the case of the Kossoff, it would be very different. The more important difference, I think, is to do with what one feels when one looks at these things, what one gets from them. And for me, I mean, I must tell you that I think Kossoff is the greatest living painter for my money. He's the chap I care about most. I feel that his portrait is both, I want to bracket it with the Holbein and with the Suti, because all three of them seem to me to express a sort of deep humanity, a deep involvement with a fellow human being, but an involvement experienced absolutely primarily through sight, through looking at that person at a certain distance from a certain place. I was much more taken in drawing terms by the Auerbach idea of engaging directly with the third dimension. I found that the measuring way of drawing and the thinking about drawing in relation to a picture plane seemed for me to rob the subject of some of its third dimension. So I was, but what I didn't like about Auerbach's approach was that it didn't seem to have enough to do with colour, with local colour and the way light affected it, and I cared about that very much. Frank used to talk about that a lot and say that he cared about it, and I suppose I just thought, well, maybe, but somehow that's not what comes across from the paintings. Anyway, I then, I finished my time in 1964, and then in 1967 I went back and did a postgraduate year at Camberwell, and in just a little while before going back, I discovered wider angle experiences for myself. We might have the next two slides while I'm talking, Pete. The next pairing. And it had happened quite naturally. I was drawing in the garden where I was staying with a friend, and I decided more or less what I was going to draw down the other end of the garden. And as I was drawing, my drawing just sort of expanded to left and right, more and more and more, until I found I was in a weird sort of world that I'd kind of never been in before when I was drawing. And it was very exciting and very heady. I'm sure you know that feeling. It doesn't happen all the time. I wish it did. When through drawing you just get completely carried away into some sort of strange, wonderful world, more real than the everyday world. And it's sort of a bit frightening, but very exciting. Anyway, I got hooked on this wider angle thing. And at about the same time, I got very interested in the painting of Bonnard, and began to form the idea that many of his paintings were of pretty wide angle experiences, and that to some extent explained the rather strange seeming drawing. Now this pairing here, that's a very bad reproduction of a very beautiful gouache. And that's a photograph that a painter called Tom Espley and I took in the room in Bonnard's house in Le Cannet, in southern France. Now, I know that we took the photograph from the right place because we were standing in a doorway and you couldn't have seen what Bonnard had drawn if you went any further away than that. Now, my wife, who's standing in the bathroom doorway, that's the doorway to the famous bathroom that you who know Bonnard will know and love. And my wife's about 6 inches taller than Bonnard. But even if you allow for that, in the photograph she looks like an Amazon. The drawing in the photograph looks weird. Whereas the drawing in the gouache is wonderful, and I can tell you, having been there, enormously more like being there, standing in that place, looking at that tiny little room, and across it somebody standing in the doorway opposite. And I had come to the feeling that for me, I'm going to be using photographs a certain amount, and it's certainly not, and I think you'll realise this already, because I think photographs are a standard of truth in drawing terms. But they are a fairly close, I haven't got time to go into it. The optical projection of a photograph is fairly close to a certain sort of perspective projection. It has a certain kind of optical truth, and so we can use it as a way of seeing how paintings and drawings diverge from that sort of projection without, necessarily doing any judging about it. Now, we'll see the next two. Now this is Bonnard again, and that painting is one of the biggest pictures he ever painted. It's about 10 foot high by 12 foot across, I think. And the drawing is big by Bonnard's standards. His drawings were normally about 5 inches by 6. This one is about 10 inches by 12. If you compare them, it's clearly the main drawing for that painting, though there were probably other drawings involved. Almost always, in Bonnard's case, there is one main drawing, usually the only one, for a painting. He drew directly from nature, more or less all the time. He had paper and pencils in his pockets wherever he went. He painted almost always from memory, using the drawings. The reason I wanted you to see these, well, mostly because they're wonderful, but so that you can see the differences, actually. Then for all the fact that one is clearly derived from the other, and they were both about standing in the same place on this terrace, that's a very wide-angle view. I didn't check my notes, I'm afraid, but I think it's about 90 degrees left to right, something like that, and a pretty big vertical angle as well. If you look at the drawing, if you look at that little wall, the edge of the terrace on the right, there's a big drop. You can see where there are sort of steps coming out in the painting. There's somebody coming up with a hat on. It's I've forgotten how far down. It's probably about 12 feet down, I'd say, from the terrace to the garden below. Maybe not much there. Anyway, along the right, to the right of the steps, there's a little sort of coping wall. And in the drawing, you can see the line of that wall going, so to speak, up the paper a bit as it goes to the right, because Bonnard was looking down and it was going away from him. So that is consistent with perspective. Now, in the painting, he's brought that direction down, so it's pretty nearly horizontal. Those sort of changes happen all the time in the change from drawings to paintings. The drawings, I haven't got time to talk about this now. Why did it happen? That's the subject for another lecture which I give. But I'll say here just that I think it's got to do, enormously to do with the fact that when you use colour, it's a different language. And the drawing had to be, so to speak, allowed to be modified by the pulls and pushes of the colour. That's not very good, but there isn't time to do any more. Now, Bonnard usually, in his wide-angle pictures, kept a consistent eye level, a horizontal eye level. And I found that I've wanted to do that almost always. I'm afraid it's going to be rather a lot about me from now on. Well, it's been pretty much about me so far, hasn't it? Anyway, now, not all artists have done that. Some wide-angle artists have been rather drawn to a kind of curved horizon, going down to the sides. Tim Hyman, who teaches here, likes that. and lots of other wonderful painters. It happens in Rouen quite a bit. But we'll see the next slides. Now, the painting, that painting by Kossoff, I hope you all saw in the wonderful exhibition of his drawings from paintings in the National Gallery, which is only just finished. But that was a big picture, about more than 7 foot both ways, of Christchurch Spitalfields. And that's a drawing from about the same place, my wife tells me. He made those drawings on the spot. He painted the picture in the studio, very obviously. Now, my wife and I went down, and she took this crazy mosaic of photographs from, as you know, where we reckon Leon must have been looking from. Now, if you meet Leon, don't tell him I've done this, because he'd be horrified. I mean, I may pluck up courage and tell him one day, but what is clear, I mean, it's clear enough looking at the painting, you don't need the photographs to tell you, is that he has not kept a consistent eye level. That road, which goes down the left-hand side of the church, is dead horizontal in real life. But it goes back a hell of a long way. And in the painting, that has resulted in it going miles further up the picture than the little parky bit to the right of the church. And you could, if you were expecting the drawing of this painting to operate by some sort of perspectival type convention, it might lead you to think that the ground was going steeply downhill from left to right, whereas it's not at all, it's pretty horizontal. It's a different sort of drawing, but it is still about being in one place, looking at a piece of the real world. So, you know, there are lots of different ways of doing it, and every artist who's any good has to find his or her own. Now then, in May 2005, I went to North Spain with my son Peter to find new subjects for painting. And I mean, I was, you know, jolly nearly but not quite blind at the time, and Peter was looking after me in every conceivable way. And he was also making a film about it at the same time. Now, we're going to see, what is it, 4 shots, Pete, of a subject that we found and which I decided that I would probably want to paint. Tell me when we've seen those 4, Pete. Or perhaps this place, Cadaqués, is just the sort of place I like. It's steep, climbing out of a bay in the northern Mediterranean, and wonderful Mediterranean light. All man-made surfaces virtually are painted white, and there are just these sort of lanes diving down and climbing up, and steps and ramps, and it's just thrilling light and thrilling space. Just what you want, just what I want. Anyway, we've seen those 4, haven't we, Pete?
Yeah.
Now then, finding this place exciting because of that look up, we called it black windows, this motif, that look up to those big open sort of windows in that tall building, which look wonderfully black against the dark sky and the white buildings. And then that pull right round to the left, to the road, diving down. So I decided where I wanted to be. Now we'll see, Peter then made a kind of mosaic of photographs for me from where I wanted to paint. Is that what we're looking at now, Peter? Yeah. Now that represents, it's not straightforward, this. There are different ways you can do it, and it doesn't sort of join up right. But the way I want to do it is to keep the camera, so to speak, vertical, and go from the top of the experience down to the bottom, making a kind of column, and then move a slot to the left and do the same again. So the verticals are kept parallel. That makes everything much too big in the corners. There is, I'm going to say more about this in a minute, but there's no right way of doing it. Anyway, this represents a hugely wide angle view. It's about getting on for 180 degrees left to right. Like that, right round, looking straight to the left, straight to the right almost. Almost down to my feet at the bottom, and a sort of neck-cricking look up to the sky above the black windows, over to the right of centre. Now, in fact, the day after we got back to Suffolk, I went totally blind. And after a bit of time being in hospital, and then a day or so wondering what the hell I was going to do with the rest of my life, I thought, well, my head's full of these subjects which I want to paint very much. I've got all this paint and brushes and stuff and canvases. I might as well have a go. It's obviously nonsense, but anyway, I did, and I had a weird hour or so painting. Completely strange. I won't take time off now. I'm telling you about that. But then when I asked my wife to have a look at it, she said, golly, well, that's all right. I can understand it, There's the table, there's Peter, there's the window, that looks like the sea, bright sun coming through the doorway there. It seemed to be there. So anyway, I thought, righto, well, that means I don't have to think of something new to do. So I then spent rather more than a year painting these subjects. And in order to navigate my canvas, I sort of felt it to begin with and imagined my subject, but then I used to sort of measure distances from the edges of the canvas. Small distances by putting elastic bands on my brush handles, bigger distances by putting elastic bands on my folding white stick. So, I could sort of work out where I was and then sort of paint from there kind of stuff. Then, when I'd done all the smaller subjects, the ones that I felt were manageable, more or less the only one I had left was black windows, and I knew when I was there that was going to need to be a big picture. It just felt as if it had to be big. And when I was sort of realised I was painting blind, I kind of thought, well, I really don't think I can paint a big picture like this. Anyway, then I'd run out of subjects, so I thought, well, might as well go for it. The canvas I got put up on the wall was about 6'8" wide, I suppose. Well, I'll say something about the height in a minute. I then started thinking about the sort of, let's call it the composition, and asking my wife to measure up this composite that we've got here, and one thing and another. And then one day I rang Peter up and I said, that black windows motif. And he said, yes, hold on, I'll get it up on the computer. He said, right, got it. I said, now I want you to do something for me. I want you to find the eye level. So we talked about that for a bit and then agreed where the eye level was. Now divide the kind of top, the picture above the eye level into 3 horizontal strips. Leave the one nearest eye level as it is. Take the one above that and stretch it upwards a bit. And then take the top one and stretch it up more. And then divide what's below the eye level into 4. And leave the 2 below eye level as they are. And then the third one squash it a bit. And then the bottom one squash it up some more. And then squash the sides in a little bit from left to right. Now we'll see the next 2, Pete, where you can see the unsquashed one on the left and the squashed and stretched one on the right. And there was a little bit more that happened a bit later on to do with, well, no, I'll say something about that in a second. Anyway, when Peter had done this, I said, now, Pete, what I want you to tell me is looking at that more like being there than looking at the other one? And Pete said, oh my God, yes, much more like it. So I said, aha, that's what I thought. Good. Right. Well, will you email that to us and we'll proceed from there. In fact, what Peter's also done is I decided that you see where the road going down to the left meets the road going away, there's a sort of corner, and where it hits the road is down below me. And that corner is really quite close, it's not very far away at all. And that seemed to be, so to speak, in horizontal terms, the kind of the turning point in the experience. The right hand, I'll call it half, but it's more than half, of course, was dominated by the look up to the black windows. And so I decided I wanted that part of the picture to be a square, and the black windows building to be in the middle of that square and to occupy a third of it. And so Peter did a bit of squashing and expanding on one thing and another to make that happen. And then the dive down to the road on the left was a half square. Now, I must tell you that what I didn't think I was doing was changing the subject. What I was doing was trying to arrive at, in my imagination, a kind of pattern, a way of giving expression to the experience of being there in a painting. And ideas about geometry and dividing rectangles and all that sort of stuff come into that. That's what I think is going on. I don't think that it's very important, this, because most of what you read about figurative painting is always confusing what happens on the canvas with the subject. And they talk about planes in the subject being tipped up, or things, churches being lent to one side, or stuff like that. I think that's not the case. I think, I don't think Soutine went around the world seeing everything like this. He knew what gravity was doing and experienced it like the rest of us. It was what happened when he started trying to paint and to use design in a way that mattered to him, that moved him, that felt most true. That was when all the stuff that chaps called distortion took place. And so I don't like that word, distortion. Anyway, where are we? Yes. Right, Pete, now I think what we do is we race through some shots of the development of this. Oh, in this case, I'll just quickly say, this canvas was very big and it was just sort of stuck to the wall. And so I couldn't feel the edges of it. So what I did was I stuck little bits of wood, a sort of very thin section, around the edge, so I could feel where the edges were. And then, because I got them there, I discovered that, I can't remember if I'd ever done this on a canvas, maybe I had, but I started sticking blobs of blue tack along the edges to mark off different intervals. So that sort of saved time, measuring across and down with the white stick all the time. Right, let's whiz through, Pete, until we get to the final state of that picture. At one point during the painting of this picture, there was a place down the road going away from me, just where the sort of space opens into the kind of horizontal courtyardy bit in front of black windows. There's a bit of wall going away up the side of that courtyardy bit and then into the road that goes away. And where that opens into the courtyard, the bottom of that little wall seemed to be a very sort of key place in the space, almost like sort of where the whole thing was spinning from. And after a while, I kept on measuring that, and it was such a bore getting there from the edge and from the bottom or from the top. I just shoved a bit of blue tack on the surface of the canvas, and I thought, yeah, that's a good idea. And so by the end of the painting, I got about 8 bits of blue tack, I think, on this. Have we got to the end, Pete?
Yeah.
Right. Well, that's that, for better or worse. That's how that ended up. All these pictures were in an exhibition I had last September. Now, when I'd finished those pictures, I thought, well, now, what am I going to do next? because these were, so to speak, the last subjects I'd seen, and I could, I suppose, remember stuff I'd seen before. That obviously seemed a possibility, but it wasn't kind of what I wanted to do at that moment. Or I could imagine stuff, but I'd never sort of been able to believe in things I imagined sufficiently to get really committed to them. That's a sort of weakness of mine, failing. So anyway, what I started doing was actually painting pictures of my wife sitting in a chair in the studio. There's an armchair, and she sat in it, taking out different poses. And I knelt on the floor in front of her, and I could just touch the two arms of the chair with my hands like that. And when the canvas I had, when I measured across that with my stick, I found that it just fitted nicely, just inside the canvas I'd got. So I thought, well, I'll let that be, so to speak, my notional picture plane. We're going to get on to more of this sort of stuff now. So that'll be at that distance from my eye. These will be true measurements that I can transfer straight to the painting. And what I found was that as I sort of felt as I learned how Francis was posing, and the shape of the chair and one thing and another, my brain just sort of did what it had been doing for 40 years or so, even though I wasn't seeing. It turned that comprehension of a three-dimensional arrangement into a sort of 2D pattern as seen from here, even though no light was doing anything to my eyes and my brain. My brain was still behaving as if it was. And so I found that I could still sort of draw in my head as if from my eyes. So I painted some pictures like this, and I was kind of painting. I wasn't really painting about the light, because that would have been remembering, and I wanted to paint about what I was finding out, albeit through touch. So I tended to just paint things the colour I knew they were. I painted the chair a sort of rather nasty chocolate brown, and my studio carpet a sort of dirty greenish colour, and Frances wearing black, which she mostly did, and her flesh sort of flesh colour. And then after I painted 2 or 3 of these pictures, I got a bit fed up with this brown chair in particular. And then I remembered that a few years before, when I painted her in that chair, I put a dust sheet over it, a sort of dirty white dust sheet, and that had ended up being a sort of pale rose in the picture. So I went to my cupboard to get a dust sheet, and I was pulling it out, and I thought, you silly bugger, you won't be able to see it anyway. You don't need that. You can paint the chair any colour you like. So I thought, wow, so I can. That's fantastic. Now we'll see the painting peak, the one you like. And that was the first one where I did this. So I said, okay, well, I'll have the chair being a sort of pale rose colour. And then I realised that I could make the background be any colour I wanted, or the floor as well. I found I didn't want to sort of, I didn't paint Frances's flesh green or blue or anything. Didn't want to do that. And I didn't want to paint her wearing colours that she didn't or wouldn't wear. So they tended to stay pretty much black or white or occasionally grey. But I did, as we shall about to see, give myself a bit of freedom in relation to a coat that she had, which, anyway. Right, now then, I was very, very close to her, and I wanted to paint the whole figure. Now, we're going to see a couple of Matisse drawings next week. One of the things that had struck me a long time ago, probably when I was drawing myself as a student, but certainly I then went on to teach at art school and other places, and I spent hundreds of hours teaching knife drawing. And one of the things that worried me slightly was that because of having maybe 12 or 20 people working for a single model, in a life class, the students were quite a long way away from the model, and yet the sort of drawings one tended to show them by way of inspiration, Degas or Rembrandt or Matisse or whoever, were almost all made from very, very much closer to the model. It seemed to me a great shame that students didn't get the chance to draw or paint really close to somebody, which is what one would sort of probably want to do if one had a model to oneself. Anyway, in these drawings, you can see in the, I think it's a pen drawing, isn't it, where you can actually see, I think, Matisse's hand, if it's the drawing I think it is, making his drawing. And then behind the model there's a mirror in which you can see Matisse, and you can tell from that he's about as close there as he could possibly be. And in the other charcoal drawing, you can tell from the way he's looking down on the front of the chair, and you can't see the legs, I think, can you? That he's very, very close. Particularly in that chair drawing, which relates more obviously to things, these paintings I was trying to make. This business of it being a really pretty big vertical angle has made interesting and at first sight strange things happen in terms of the drawing. Now, Pete, let's see the early shot of what we call the butterfly painting. This is the early stage of another painting of Frances. In this one, although she's wearing black, she's got a coat, a rather swanky coat that somebody gave her. I think it's Kenzo or somebody. It's a very classy coat, and it's got a big collar and a satin lining, which I don't think is a particularly striking colour. But and certainly the coat isn't black. But I thought it would be fun to have her wearing that coat and it sort of opened out over the chair with a really bright lining, a sort of magenta lining, and I wanted that against yellow. What happened with these pictures really was that I would, when we'd agreed on a position, I would then sort of start understanding the position and sort of measuring and placing bits of blue tack on my canvas. By now, these pictures tended to have 50 or 60 bits of blue tack on them. And then, sort of, while I was doing this drawing, which didn't all happen at once, of course, I mean, you know, it's sort of a fairly lengthy process, and Fanny would come and post to me when she got time. I would be thinking about the picture any other time, you know, I mean, it's just as much there when I was having a bath as when I was in my studio. And I'm waiting in a way for a sort of colour chord to suggest itself to me. I didn't paint about light in any overt way. I didn't want to paint different surfaces of the forms of the chairs, say, in different tones or colours to indicate directional light, because that would have all been made up, so to speak, nothing to do with the experience I was having. I hope that the colours I was using in some sort of more intuitive way suggested a kind of light and made a sort of space, but I just had to hope for the best on that, and people seem to think that they do, which is gratifying. Anyway, now in that early state you can see that the drawing's weird, the head's tiny, and there's sort of funny stuff happening down at the bottom, and it's all, you know, pretty much out of hand. Now this is the point where I need to say a bit more about measuring and projection. So we're now going to see a Hugo. Some of you may have seen this recently because there were a couple of retrospectives to coincide with the publication of the catalogue resume of Hugo's paintings. And this painting, I think, was in Browse and Derby. But more than that, if some of you might have seen a film, very bad print of it, which was made by an arts program called Aquarius in 1976, of Hugo painting this picture. Not actually of him painting it. He never used to let people see him painting, but he let them into the studio and talked to them at the end of the day's painting, one thing or another. Now, as I said, Hugo started with a kind of an idea. This picture is called root 5 rectangle, which is the proportion of that particular rectangle. And he had an idea about a certain sort of pose within that rectangle. Now, he wanted the front edge of the table that the model was lying on to make a horizontal line across the bottom of the canvas. Now, Hugo's perspective, linear perspective, is to do with a flat plane between the viewing point and the subject, and the straight rays of light from the subject intersecting that plane and giving rise to a pattern. And that pattern can then be transferred to canvas or wall or whatever. And the theory, well, indeed it's perfectly true optically. If you then look at the canvas or the wall from the same, well, if it's the same size as that plane, from the same distance and same position, the pattern it gives your eye will be the same as the pattern that the subject gave your eye. So that's the way perspective works, and it's more or less how a camera works, but there are complications to do with photography which we can't go into now. Now, it's actually almost impossible to measure from life in this linear perspective way, because the distance from your eye to that flat plane is different according to the difference above or below, or to left or right, of the central point of looking through the plane. Because as you move away from that central point, the distance from your eye gets greater. So you would need to, I mean, if you had a sheet of glass in front of you, or as John Wollacott does, a sheet of perspex, then you can do it. Keep your head still, and you can make marks on the perspex, which is what Wollacott does. Puts a bit of colour on it too, I think, and actually exhibits the perspex as well as the paintings. But if you haven't actually got a plane there, it's impossible to know really whether you're measuring at the right different distances as you move out from the central point. Now, what Hugo does, and what people normally do whether they realise they're doing it or not, is measure on the inside of a hemisphere with its centre at the eye. In other words, they're measuring equal distances from the eye in all directions. If you think of that, you've got a bit of string with a pencil on the end of it. The end of the string is at your eye. If you go all round like that, what you're describing is a hemisphere, centre your eye, or you know, some part of that convex sphere. Now, in fact, in practice, what most people do isn't that at all, because they hold their arm up. Now, your shoulder is not in your eye, so as you measure above your shoulder and above your eye, the distance from your eye gets shorter. As you measure down below your eye, the distance from your eye is longer. So this sort of measuring is terribly inaccurate. I don't know exactly how Hugo measured it, because as I say, there are very few people who've seen him paint. But I assume that he must have had a rod or a string or something which he's held to his eye. He possibly had some sort of headgear, such that he was measuring. No, seriously, because he would certainly have been painting with one eye only. Such that he was measuring always from the same distance from his eye. Now, there's a further problem to do with this, which, when I was making this particular painting, I had a long telephone conversation with Francis Hoyland, who some of you know, who teaches here, who's a great pal of mine, about measuring and projections and one thing and another. And he said, well, you know, that measuring on the inside of a hemisphere doesn't work. So I sort of said, yeah, well, I know that, but it's what I'm doing. He said, and anyway, and he then reminded me of something which I knew but I'd forgotten, which is that if you're measuring in that sort of way, you must use the same module of measuring the whole time. Because, now, those of you who are mathematical will get this straight away. Other people might have more difficulty. But if you think of looking down on a circle, and the centre of the circle being your eye, the circumference is, so to speak, the plane on which you are measuring. You're, so to speak, looking through and making measurements around that circumference. And a measurement is, so to speak, a chord on your circumference. That's the distance between, chord is the distance between one point and another point on the circumference. Okay? Now then, if you add together a lot of little chords, you get a much longer distance when they're added together than if you simply measure from one place on the circumference right across to the other. Now that'll be clear to some people, but possibly not everybody. Now the extreme case, which might help you, is it's supposing you were painting 180 degrees left to right, which I do, used to, well, still do from time to time. Then the chord, if you were simply to measure from the very left-hand side of the experience to the right, that would be the diameter of the circle, wouldn't it? Yes. Okay, now, if you were to measure all the way around, with little measurements all the way around, that would tend to half the circumference of the circle, which, as you will all know, is pi times the diameter divided by 2. Now, that is roughly 1.5 times as long as the diameter. So, if you're going in for this sort of measuring in anything like rigorous way, you must use the same measuring length. Now then, we'll get back to this painting of Hugo's. Hugo wanted that front edge of the table to be a horizontal line. Now, because he was looking down on it, what his system of measurement and projection would have given him was a curve which went up to the edges. Do you understand that? Because the middle would be nearer to his eye, and it would get further and further from his eye as it went away to left and right. And because he was looking down, that would mean that those things curved up. So in order to get a horizontal projection on his painting, with his piece of string, I'm guessing now, attached to his eyeball with a drawing pin, and a pencil at the other end, he was about 6 foot away from the table, apparently. He then drew, must have had a long arm, he then drew a curve across the front of the table. He then got his saw out and cut that curve out, so that that curve would then give a projection which was exactly horizontal. He then painted on the edge of the table that keypad, which is made up of 100 equal divisions. And because the edge of the table was equal from his eye all the way around, they were equal divisions. And that meant that by using a plumb line, he could arrive at a measurable distance across the picture, all the way across any one of those 100 positions, and find different places on the model. Now, what he did vertically, I don't know, and I'd love to meet somebody who knows more about Hugo's way of painting than I do to find out about that. Because the thing about, Francis was dead right when he said, you can't use a kind of hemispherical projection and transfer it onto a flat canvas. And all you have to think about to understand this are maps of the world. And you all know, I'm sure, that geographers have used different kinds of projection for trying to get from the surface of a sphere onto a flat sheet of paper. And none of them work. And whatever system you use is better in some ways and worse in others. And the commonest ones, I think, was devised by a chap called Mercator. I think that's the one we know. And I can't remember how it works, but I know it means that if you don't understand this sort of stuff's going on, you get a very wrong idea about the sizes of countries near to the equator as compared with ones near to the pole, and that sort of thing. So it doesn't work, you see. Now, I don't know what Hugo thought about this. I'd like to know, because he clearly was doing that sort of measuring, and he certainly understood all of these things that I'm talking about infinitely better than I do. So he's made some sort of decision, but I'm not quite sure what it was. Anyway, what I realised, we can't go back easily, can we, Pete? Yeah. Could you go back to the early stage of that painting of mine? Have you got that? Mm. Now, what I realised was that all this stuff to do with my shoulder not being in my eye, and I kind of had been trying a bit to allow for the business of, long measurements being, as it were, too short compared with the addition of short measurements. But kind of, intuitively is not the right word, but not fully working it out. But clearly the fact that measuring up above my eye level and down below, that was clearly all going to pop because, for example, the head was so much too small. So I thought, well, I've got to do something about this. So I invented what I call a drawing machine. We'll see the next after you. So what I did was I set up my easel so that the top of it was where my eye was when I was kneeling there looking. And I attached sticks to the easel which represented straight rays of light. And along the sticks, at the appropriate distance from my eye, I had elastic bands, which was the distance to the notional picture plane. And so I could put the sticks, as it were, on Francis's shoulders, and then measure across the elastic bands, and that would be a chord on that notional hemispherical picture plane. And by that means, I started to get a better sort of drawing. So we'll look at the final picture now, which I think is definitely better than it was early on. Now, I must say that in the first place, as you probably would have gathered if you can remember what I was saying about an hour ago, I was no great fan of measuring. And didn't, I paid my dues. I did my time when I was influenced by Hugo and other used to know type chaps at Camberwell. But it didn't seem for me to render the sort of truest, to my experience, response. But when I found myself trying to paint when I was totally blind, I had to go back to this sort of stuff as a help. So I didn't like it. It was just the best I could do. In the same way that I didn't like working from photographs. I hated it to begin with. But I kind of, it was all I could do really. And chaps said, you need one of it, your paintings don't look much like photographs. So that was reassuring. What I'm really saying is that these measurements, this sort of system of placing blue tack by measuring, wasn't in any way part of my subject. The bits of blue tack get moved about, not just because I re-measure and find out that I've got things wrong, but because of just not feeling right, and also conversations I have with the editor-in-chief, who is my wife, and the other members of my family, about what's going on. I mean, we've devised over the years a sort of a way of talking about paintings which gives me the information I want without giving me the information I don't want, and occasionally results in hilarious misunderstandings and me getting, I'm ashamed to say, on occasion a bit cross, but not too often, I hope. What did occur to me the other day when I was working on one of these pictures was, well, two things. One was that when I was an apprentice, an engineering apprentice, I spent about a year and a half in a drawing office, well, actually in two different drawing offices, making measured drawings of three-dimensional objects, machine tools and parts of motor cars. So the business of making measured drawings on a flat plane about three-dimensional things was something I'd done a lot of in a pretty rigorous way, but not in an art context before I went to art school. And then the other thing that occurred to me, because as I say, in these pictures I've got 50, 60 or more bits of blue tack, which I get to know pretty intimately. When I was an apprentice, I was in the works chess team, and one day, in order to wind up the chess captain, who thought he was much better than any of the other of us, I challenged him to a game of blindfold chess. And he said, "Don't be silly." So I said, "Well, I'll tell you what, I'll play blindfold, and you look, and you give me a sort of decent handicap." And we played all through the lunch hour, and at the end of the time, the other players adjudicated a draw, to the absolute fury of the captain. And I found that it wasn't nearly as difficult as I thought it was going to be. Anyway, since going, too blind to play chess and now totally blind, I do play blindfold chess a certain amount with my sons. And, I'm not very good at it, but good enough for us to have a game. I played one game in Spain with Peter that lasted for 8 hours. We don't go wrong all that often. Maybe 2 or 3 times during a game things go seriously astray. And I thought that's got something to do. I mean, remembering the position of 32 chess pieces on a 64 square board is not so very different, and is certainly perhaps a pretty good preparation for remembering the position of 60 pieces of blue tack in a rectangle. So all these sort of things in my past have kind of been there to help me when I've needed them. And in a funny way, I think probably that these pictures that I've made since becoming blind probably do express more the whole of me, the whole of my personality, than the paintings made when I could see better. I don't know, it's funny stuff. Right, now, we're sort of, there's only one little verse to go now. We'll see. Anyway, I painted a lot of these pictures, and I'm still painting them, and I like painting them a lot. And I think my next show next spring will be entirely of pictures of Francis sitting in one of 2 chairs, but different colours. But I've been wondering all the time about other subjects that I want to go on painting Francis. I painted 2 little heads of my son. And that was quite interesting. I'm not going to show you that. And then there was a time when my sister was sort of brother sitting while Francis was in France for a week or so, and she helped me put another one of these big bits of canvas up on the studio wall. And I used to think about it and hope that the subject would come to me. And a couple of times a possible subject did, and I got almost to the point of starting to paint, and then it sort of went off the boil and wouldn't do. And then about, a month ago, probably not much more than a month ago, I did get an idea, and I can't now remember how it came to me, which is infuriating. I started painting this big picture, and we'll see an early stage of it now, Pete. And it's sort of imagining a place a bit like Cadaqués. but it isn't there. It's different in important ways. And there are these two very big figures, almost life-size. And again, I don't think, well, I know I've never painted a whole figure sort of that close in a painting before. And it made me think, again, of Bonnard, I suppose, inevitably, who's had a massive influence on me, undeniably. And one of the things I've always thought about Bonnard and like about him enormously is that I think he painted things very much closer to his eye than just about anybody else ever did, because I think he didn't set up subjects. He just went about life, and when something struck him as being marvellous, he'd whip out a bit of paper and draw it. And if there was some head, you know, a few inches away from him, blocking part of his view, he didn't sort of pretend it wasn't there or move a bit. That was part of the experience. Or if there were leaves hanging down from a tree, almost touching his forehead, they came into the picture. And I don't think anybody else had done that before. I think he painted more the absolutely whole of what it was like, just sort of looking at anything, than anybody else. Anyway, that's my view, and it's one of the many things I love about him. Anyway, now let's see that picture in the studio, Pete. So I got a round table from the garden, and sat imagining that I was sitting at a cafe table with another cafe table on my right, and imagining looking out at the sea on the left and one thing and another. And then we'll see the next one, Pete, with Frances posing. I got Franny to come and stand and be probably herself, though I wasn't particularly thinking about who this person was, drawing, looking up to sea. And she was just about at sort of touching distance. And now then, I need to say something else about wide-angle subjects here. The subjects I found myself wanting to paint, which were quite often anything up to about 180 degrees left to right, and fairly wide angle vertically, but 90 degrees would be a very big vertical angle. Well, now by measurement terms, that, so to speak, gives you a double square, twice as wide as it is high. Now, when I was standing thinking about painting, say that Black Windows painting, and imagining some sort of canvas, some sort of pattern being able to be a sort of metaphor for that experience, I would have some sort of idea about size, like as I told you in the case of the Black Windows picture. I kind of knew it would need to be big, and I would have some idea about format, about proportion, and somehow those panoramic proportions never seemed right to me. My sort of ability to make sense in a rectangle just doesn't extend to those sort of rectangles. It has done on occasion, but it's very rare for me to feel that I can be expressive in a very long, thin rectangle. I'm drawn more to squarer rectangles. Well, then you get the problem of how to resolve the experience into the rectangle in a way that's believable, that doesn't result in shapes that seem silly. And I suppose I like that challenge. That's one of the things I like about wide-angle views. Now then, what goes wrong in these things, with this sort of projection, is the corners. things in the corners get much too big. That's if you keep the verticals parallel, which I tend to want to do. I didn't always do it. An alternative is to go for something more like a sort of fisheye lens projection, but that sort of looks silly. I mean, there have been times when I painted and made drawings like that, and when I did it, it seemed right. And you can learn to see like that. If you draw like that all the time, you can absolutely learn to see the world in a fisheye way. I don't recommend it. I don't think it's very nice, but not a nice experience, but it's exciting. Anyway, now somebody that close, my eye level is about sort of underside of ribs height, with me sitting there and Francis standing there. When you're that close, the actual foreshortening down through the figure, because I was sitting there, I don't know, can you see me in this light or not? I was sort of sitting there on a chair this sort of height, and her feet were about there. I could just sort of see them beyond my knees. Massive foreshortening. Now, somehow you could teach yourself to see people looking like that with massive foreshortening, but it's not what everyday experience is like. When you look at somebody standing close to you, you see somebody standing close to you, and if there's somebody with long legs, you sort of know there's somebody with long legs. And you know they're close, and you know you're looking down, but I don't think you see that pattern that you would get in a photograph, let's say. Or I don't anyway. Well, I don't see it now, of course. But now we'll see a couple of Bonnards. Now, Bonnard painted being close to people all the time. And here are two examples. Wonderful, fantastic paintings. And I know exactly where he was in the bathroom picture, because I've been there, and I couldn't bring it for reasons which I won't bother to explain now, but I have actually got a photograph of somebody posing, not new, but somebody about the right size, like that. And the foreshortening in a photograph is absolutely enormous. Bonnard was standing in the doorway. That bathroom was very small. He was terribly, terribly close to art. I'm sure the same was true in the picture on the left with that extraordinary band of sunlight. I think, incidentally, this is not relevant to the main thrust of the lecture, but I think that in that painting, Bonnard is looking into a mirror. And I think we can see, is it on the left, a little bit of wallpaper to the left of the edge of the mirror. And I think that strip of light upmark is probably sunlight reflecting off the mirror from a gap in a slightly open door or some weird thing like that. He just saw these weird effects of light. I mean, I don't know whether you realise this. You're all still here, or the ones who are here are still here. So we are nearly at the end. But it's such wonderful stuff. This I can't resist a little digression. Do you realise that there are only 2 times a year when the sun is shining at exactly the same angle? There are no other times. There are 2 times only in the year. I mean, if you take any one moment, now let's say, if the sun is shining from a certain height and a certain direction, i.e. the actual solid angle it's making, it only ever is in that same position at that time once again in a year before you get back to this time next year. Now, if you're a painter of precise effects of light like Bonnard, that is a thrilling thought, because you could see something like that and perhaps not see it again for 10 years, because maybe that time the sun wasn't shining, or you were few minutes too late or something. So life is full of, I mean, everything you see is completely unique. Every thing you see throughout your life has never been that way before and will never be that way again. And if you like, you can be excited by that idea. Anyway, now in these pictures, if you look, you see the figures are wonderfully figure-like. But when you look at what's going on around them, you can see how much he was looking down. Now, that can cause people who expect the drawing and paintings to look like photographs or linear perspective or some such thing, to say that they're very distorting. And most of the people who write about Bonner talk about this in terms of sort of abstract ideas about making pretty pictures. Now, of course, that comes into it the whole time because a beautiful pattern is the medium of expression, just as beautiful sounds are the medium of expression in music. But I don't think that's why that sort of drawing occurs in these paintings. I think it's what happened when Bonner was terribly excited about a certain situation, in these cases being very close to somebody, and tried to make sense of it, the best sense he could, with a coloured pattern. And the information about looking down is there in the floor and the tops of the chairs, and weird stuff going on to the right in the painting with the gold stripe. But somehow the figure is kind of looking like a figure, not like some sort of freaky foreshortened thing. But something's got to give, and that's his solution to this problem, and very wonderful it is too. Now, it happens in relation to my problem, and I think this was Bonner's too, possibly, that one's always inclined to read too much of oneself into the masters one loves. It helps with that sort of vertical thing. If we go back to my sad painting by comparison, the fact that I didn't want that terrific foreshortening through the figure means that I can use up a lot of that much too highness of my rectangle as compared with its width. Do you see what I mean? I'm not putting this very well. Now, I think all we've got left to do, Pete, is just see this picture up to the present moment. I'm still painting this. Is that right, Pete?
Yeah.
We just got, what, another 3 stages to go or something. What the drawing you can see is changing in partly to do with me trying to understand the space I'm imagining better, partly to do with me imagining a slightly different space. There's sort of feedback all the time between these things as I try to understand better about what happens when I look from there to over there and imagine a kind of architecture which would enable me to have the sort of spatial drama in the picture that I want. That road going away on the right. And the steps, and then opening up the space beyond these near figures. And that girl at some stage appears just to the left of the waiter with a bright green skirt. And I was very pleased with that for a while. But then when the things opened up on the right in a different way, and I started getting the steps on the right-hand edge became more important. I went out of the picture and I had people on those steps, and then I started trying to put figures going away or coming towards me on the road on the right. Somehow the tension between that look and the girl's green skirt didn't seem to work And so we took all the colour out of her skirt and put it instead up into that tablecloth hanging over the balcony rail of the window high up. That seemed a sort of better place for the colour to pull the eye. And you see, this is an example of how colour and drawing, of course, are not separate things. They do and must affect each other the whole time. Anyway, this is painting in progress, and that's where we've got to so far, where I've got to. Now, that's all I've got for you. I'm delighted to try and answer any questions any of you might want to ask, but I know I've been a hell of a lot longer than an hour, so if you're desperate to push off, then obviously do. But as I was saying, I'm happy to have a stab at any questions.